Good afternoon, everyone. Craig Simpson from Radiant Creators and myself just did a full 2-hour interview. I know you're going to like the content of it. It's more on the vibrational frequency side of things, in addition to getting your mind, body, and spirit ready for the changes in the grand solar minimum. All the links are in the description box below for Radiant Creators, not only the podcast, the YouTube channel, and the website. So this is going to be part 1 through 4. Going to cut it up so wherever you are in the series, I'll leave the links in the screens at the end. So you can go ahead and just click and jump through part 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll leave up the full interview in case you want to view it that way, and also look for the podcast coming out. And again, everything is in the description box for all the links that you'll need, including social media and a way to get a hold of Craig after the interview.
Here we are on Radiant Creators. We've got DuByne, Adapt 2030. He is in Asia right now, Taipei, Taiwan. And I got to ask, what are you doing over there?
Well, when I saw the future, I started working in China, because you have to understand the reason I'm into this grand solar minimum, the changes that occurred on our planet here and are occurring. I used to be the most staunch global warming believer, CO2 believer there was on the planet. I even started an algae diesel company in China back in 2006 and 7 with 5 other American guys to produce oil from algae using bags floating on a fish farm out in Sichuan province, because they had millions of acres of fish farms across China. You're not using land at that point. So being such a staunch believer in CO2, I actually took action to try to mitigate what was going on with CO2. Now, the economy collapsed over there, and we had a few problems producing energy in China, being a 100% owned American company startup there. Went down to Myanmar and started trading Arabica coffee. This is the interesting thing, is because the farmers in 2012 and 11 started telling us about cold weather crop losses that they were getting down there on the plants. And I said, well, that doesn't make sense. Burma, Myanmar now, but formerly known as Burma, is an equatorial band country. So when I heard cold weather crop losses, I didn't understand what that really meant to me, because we were looking out about 5 years to see if we could bring on more supply, because you had to pre-buy the seedlings, and they had to raise them up and then plant them out in the fields to give you the extra acreage to bring on more tonnage. But then I started looking into it. Why were they getting cold weather crop losses for several years in a row? And that's what led me to what I'm doing right now with the Grand Solar Minimum, the channel I've created, Adapt 2030 on YouTube, as well as the Mini Ice Age Conversations podcast. Anywhere you can find podcasts hosted across the net. And that's kind of a long introduction there, more than a minute, more than I wanted to speak. But anyway, gives you a good rundown on how I'm really involved and why I'm involved, not just because I'm here randomly.
I like that. And it seems like there's a big difference between living a life searching for the truth, or being open to the truth, having sort of a never-ending evolution, and then just getting stuck in dogma or entrenched beliefs. And it seems like many people, you started out, like myself, believing global warming, because I think originally when I was really young, it was a coming global ice age, and then it changed to global warming, and now it's just climate change. Any change in the weather is proof, supposedly, says Al. And so so you kind of went into it briefly there, but how did you get so interested in climate science? And also, I guess you should really do an intro, a little bit about you. You've put out an amazing amount of work. Your Adapt 2030 YouTube channel, you're putting out, gosh, at least once a week or so, real amazing information. So I guess as we kind of form this into an interview, now that we got all the sound working, really, what led you to your passion as a scientist, especially with the climate, and how do you keep the passion to keep putting out so much content, which is controversial and absolutely true?
Well, as we move forward into this is the most important thing in everybody's life. This is going to be the greatest single event in at least 400 years to sweep across this planet. It's going to include everybody. Every genre of society will be in rich, poor, middle class, no job, job, never educated, educated. I don't care what you are, what race, religion, economic strata you're in, you're going to be affected as well. So when I look out at the traditional, what they've been brought up, and all of us have been brought up in, get a job, work, save for retirement, that doesn't exist anymore at all. At least in my personal opinion. Now you can agree or disagree with that, but the research I've done has led me down this road to, this is the most important thing ever, literally, in the last centuries. I want to be part of the change, bringing the information, because the more prepared you are, the better it's going to be for all of us. Because I look at it like this, if I just kept all this information to myself, I'm one guy. Could I survive as well if there's 500 other people that are prepared and we're working together? Because I feel that, and as you look through history, communities that work together had the greatest survival rates. And if you read about the accounts in Bosnia, which I'm really into right now, I'm reading a couple books called The Year in Hell, Bosnian survivor accounts, they detail it. You need community to survive this thing. The people who were by themselves, they all died. They were all taken over by thieves and bandits. So it was those who were in communities and organized, helping each other, swapping skill sets, swapping knowledge. You know, they go through this whole different thing of value chain. A person who could create kerosene to fill lanterns, their bellies never were hungry. A person who could refill Bic lighters, their bellies never went hungry. Some of the craziest things that you would think, nah, that can't be exchanged for anything. They were living off of just trading Bic lighters and refilling Bic lighters. That's how valuable to start a fire, a skill set it is. So, I'm trying to read as much as I can about prior accounts of what happened. And you as a listener, really, if you don't know anything about the Grand Solar Minimum, I encourage you to start with John Casey, former NASA Space Shuttle advisor. He details everything, and he's the first contact point I had when I started learning about this. I followed his research, and going through history, your skill set is going to be your greatest asset. It's not going to be such a physical thing. I mean, it could be, but the skills you have in your head to be able to trade value for somebody else, moving down through all these changes, because these changes are so unknown to us. I mean, certainly it happened in 1600s, 1300 or 1200s into the 1300s, 800 AD, 400 AD, turn of the second millennium, back when birth of Christ, 400 BC, and routinely these 400-year marks in time, we get these repeats. This time we have different technologies, different kind of communication devices. We can share, swap different types of information. So it's going to be different. We can't just look back in the 1600s and say it's going to be exactly like this. It's absolutely not. It's going to be continuously morphing, changing scenarios and move forward. So your skills, you're going to need to build those out, because as the world morphs around you, if you still have the skill, you can just plug it back into where the world has moved to. And if you're smart enough to look out a few years to see where the world's going, you can place yourself there. So when the world catches up, you're already right there. That's what I did a few years ago with this channel. About 5 years ago, I thought, we're going to reach this point where there's going to be a global awakening. And then here we are right now.
Yeah, global awakening. A global awakening is a tough thing, because we hope so, and that'd be a question I'd have is, well, before I ask if you think there's a global awakening happening, because there's different ways to look at that, I would say, could you describe a grand solar minimum for us? Because there's a lot of people who are listening, and this will be the first that they've heard of this, and it's important that we get this info to them. I mean, a grand solar minimum, how would you describe that and give us some idea of a timeline on that, just so people have a foundation, they understand what we're speaking about?
Okay, a grand solar minimum is just a prolonged cycle in the sun of low solar activity, far lower than anything that we see in the 11-year solar cycle. So as you peruse through the news these days, you'll see we're at the solar minimum, and we've entered, well, some say now with the new sunspots that have just occurred in the last week or so, into solar cycle 25. I firmly believe we have another year before we get into solar cycle 25. But the news is always talking about the 11-year solar cycle. Let's take a step back. We need to start small to come big. So sunspots, that's the indicator of activity on the sun. So when we go to 0 sunspots, that's when we're in this solar minimum on the 11-year cycle. Well, those in turn are encapsulated in larger cycles. So we come up to this 400-year cycle, which we're entering right now, that's overriding, and it's a more powerful cycle than the 11-year cycle. But we need to take that step back, because solar activity You need to take a look at the actual amount of, during that solar cycle, how much activity it was, lower or higher. And then if we take a further step back and we look back in time over thousands of years, you can see that the solar activity dictates the rise and fall of civilizations. Now, the grand solar minimum in itself is just a very low solar activity period that lasts for about 30 years. That's the definition of it. The magnetic waves on the sun cancel each other out. There's 4 of them up there, and they go into a canceling mode where there's not going to be much sunspot activity. The amount of solar activity is going to decline to the lowest we've seen in 400 years. That's truly what the grand solar minimum is. Now, since our Earth is connected to that sun, that big thing over to the left that's 1.2 million times larger than us, when there's electrical or magnetic or electromagnetic effects on the sun decreasing, obviously our Earth is going to step down lockstep with the decreasing solar activity. Just if you look at the 11-year solar activity, we can see small microcycles within there on how the weather behaves strangely when we get to the solar minimum like we are now. But just trace it back and then go whoosh, take a large step in that larger cycle in the 400-year, and you start to see these gigantic decreases in productivity, dark ages, and collapse of kings, queens, empires. And everywhere you look across the planet, it's always the same time frame. Ask yourself why. It's all based on the sun. So once you know this is the base layer of information, sunspots, the amount of activity in a full solar cycle, and then solar cycles over thousands of years, how these affect society. And this is why we're coming back into another one, why it's so important to talk about it. CO2 causation. If it does have any, I won't say it has no effect. I would say maybe 5% of all the changes on the planet we're seeing have anything to do with CO2. The rest of it's mainly with pollutants that are coming out of the smokestacks across the world, ship tracks that are all across that nobody wants to talk about. Global shipping is one of the main polluters on the planet, nor air travel. Oh my gosh, we'd have to cut economic revenue. Well, why don't we just talk about CO2, a pretty much non-inert gas. 0.04% of our atmosphere is CO2, if you didn't know that. So instead of really addressing the elephant in the room with the real pollutants on the planet, with really, having a lot of effect in terms of cloud nucleation, et cetera, why is nobody talking about cutting emissions globally? Oh, that would be too economically inconvenient. So they choose to say, this grand solar minimum is going to increase the temperature 3 degrees Celsius globally by 2025, 2028, somewhere in that range. You talk about timelines, we can talk about that as well. Exact dates for what's going to happen, way more precise than the IPCC's projections.
So you're breaking up a little bit there when you were talking, but I think a lot of it got across. But so with the grand solar minimum coming, being very inevitable, and you mentioned that civilizations they rise and fall really tied to global solar minimums. And so with that said, it's very curious because you do look at history and you wonder, well, what happened to Rome? Why isn't it here? Why would it go away? It doesn't quite make sense, and it begins to explain things. Then, of course, you look into the magnetic pole reversals and cataclysms and much more devastating events. Then that begins to make sense also. So at this time, like one of the things you put out in a video recently was how really the governments around the world, their reaction to the global solar minimum. So as you were saying in the video, they know and they've known for quite some time. And so they're telling us, and they're making more and more of a blind religion out of it, truly, that, global warming. I've never seen people more out of their minds on many levels than they are right now. But also, especially with global warming, it divides family, there's friendships that end. I mean, it's truly a cult. And it seems that the governments of the world, and since they're tied to the mainstream media, you look at like Silicon Valley, just technology in general, there's a huge orchestrated propaganda effort that we believe global warming is the only possibility. It's absolute doctrine. I mean, I don't think it'll be that long before there already is, but violence over it. I mean, there definitely is a form of violence happening now. And so how does that play into past, civilizations that have come and gone, because it seems that as what's obvious is happening, I've been surprised recently listening to your work and other people's work at how extreme the censorship is, at how extreme the effort to hide what the weather is doing while people in this country are drowning. It's like, has this always been the case through the cycles of history with empires falling based on solar minimums, that the powers that be try to hide them from the people?
Yeah, you look routinely through history, and we could start back with the Cathars, or we could start in the Roman Empire. We could start anywhere, go back to Turkey with the Gutenberg printing press being illegal. The dissemination of information, the powers that be from this top-down pyramidal structure of power, they don't want the masses knowledgeable about pretty much the workings of the solar system, the universe in general, our galaxies, etc., because these patterns repeat. And a repeating pattern, if it's close enough and starting, what we've been fed is, save for the retirement 60 years from now, it won't be here. So how do you keep people on the treadmill if what their goal is at the end of their retirement and chilling on a beach with margaritas is no longer there? See, it's about population control. And what I really feel like right now, it's going to be triage more than it will be bring people through this grand solar minimum. You hit it on the head when you were growing up. You said that they were talking about ice ages first. Then we come into the grand solar minimum. We're back in. I think that one reprieve of heat, if you want to look this up, and everything I say today, I don't want you to listen to me. I do not want you to believe me blindly. It is your job and your responsibility to fact check what I say and fact check everything that goes on, and then hopefully it will lead you to at least another avenue where you can start digging further into the effects of past societies, going back to centuries, millennia, on these grand solar minimums, as well as what we can expect moving forward, and truly how the governments of the planet are trying to, I think they're trying to avoid mass panic at the moment. Because if everybody knew in my head what's going on, everybody would pretty much quit their job, except for keeping going where the revenue can come in so you can still prepare for these events, as well as trying to disseminate the information. That's kind of the niche I have. Now, I listened to your interview with Diamond up at the Oppenheimer Ranch Project. Great interview, by the way. You asked him some good questions. I hadn't heard him talk like that before any other time in any interview. So whatever you asked really turned him into more of a, get into that personal level of why he does what he does. But he said something interesting, like, nobody's messed with my channel. I haven't been demonetized. Nobody censored me. Well, since that interview, his channel has been totally demonetized. Every video, over 1,000 of his videos is totally demonetized, and several of them have been completely removed. So he started going on proactively and removing videos. I think he's removed 50 or 70 of them himself already. And that's just since the last week that you did the interview with him. Now, as we move forward with this grand solar minimum, when you're starting to talk about food riots in cities based on the non-prepared people, I don't think governments are really going to want you to share that information so much. Now, will it start this year, food riots? No. 2023? Absolutely. Everywhere across the planet. By 2028, the forecast is we're going to be growing only 20% of what we're growing today. I'll take that into consideration for a moment. That's a heavy statement. So let's use 100, for example. If we have 100 tons of food today, we're only going to be able to grow 20 tons of food by 2028, and that will be a 4 or 5 year period, 2028 through 2032. We're going to get almost no solar activity. Global agriculture is going to plummet. And the people who are putting out these forecasts are calling on governments to already start stockpiling food right now, today, for these lean times coming up in almost 10 years from now. They're falling on deaf ears. When you try to repeat the information, it's not on the choice columns on the side. You have to actually manually enter the URL to even find the video. They're not really, censoring it in such a way where they completely remove it, but they make it incredibly difficult to find. And when you're sharing things like this across social media, they just don't make the feed. Sometimes you'll have to post a video through traditional mediums 5, 6, 7, 8 times before even 2 people will see it. It's just not going to get in the feed. So I'm not going to say it's censorship, like, they're handcuffing you and putting you in jail for writing something on the net. But as you try to put out this information, there's definitely a stonewall at the moment on putting causation with sun to the effects we're seeing, and now taking it a step further, like Christian at Ice Age Farmer does, and myself too to some extent, the crop losses that are occurring. Now, my whole new thing moving forward is economy and this, because before I was focused on the sun, the effects on the societies that we've seen in past cycles. I like to go, I'm an ancient history buff. I love that stuff. When I go travel and I go to countries, I go to see the ancient ruins, the artifacts. I go to see the museums. I go to talk to people, visit ancient sites, look for the ley lines, all this kind of stuff. That's me. But I want to tie it into the economy now, because, you know, the economy moving forward is going to be the strangle point that's going to cause all the chaos. Just the food being lost itself. People get hungry, they do crazy stuff. Okay, one thing. But in the lead up to that, there's going to be a significant amount of global chaos in the economy, contractions everywhere. And, you know, if you can put at least some dates onto that moving out, I think it could be more helpful for people who are trying to prepare.
And one of the great ways to prepare for this situation, it seems, is to, well, grow your own food, which is something you speak about. And
Always.
yeah. And the thing is, in preparing for a grand solar minimum, and like you mentioned, Ice Age Farmer, and of course, Diamond from Oppenheimer Ranch, and of course, there's LeakCon coming up where you're going to be also, and we're going to be there too. Really, yes, it's about preparing for something, but I think also essentially it's about living a full spectrum life, living a natural human life. It's living closer to nature, actually living with a relationship to nature at all, which many people don't have, and actually having, like, what happened to the victory garden? People used to have big victory gardens in their backyard. People, I think our grandparents especially, they would have a large closet full of food. They would preserve food that they grew. So it seems that we are really living in a just-in-time economy, which when it comes to a grand solar minimum, especially one that people don't see coming, you know, we're living on the edge of disaster, because if there's no food in the store, we're starving, you know, within a day, an individual. Maybe not starving, but they don't have what they need. So it seems like, what steps are you taking to be a full spectrum human, to live as we should, to have a sense of and a reality of sovereignty, to be able to take care of yourself if the world outside goes away? If Amazon Prime doesn't work tomorrow, how do you keep going?
Yeah, again, the physical dense level is the last thing you need to worry about. The first levels are your mental and spiritual readiness. The physical readiness comes after that. So the reason, again, that I do the channel is so you don't come at it with fear, because fear is paralyzing. You know, after a while, you get numb to that fear, so it could be dangerous as well, because you're numb to the fear. So if anything happens, then, you know, I wasn't afraid because I got numb to it the whole time. Understanding the mechanisms of the change is going to be one of your greatest assets, because once you understand the mechanism, you can actually yourself look out a few years in advance and see in your area what's going to happen. Is it going to become wetter, colder, drier? Because as you look right now, I'll give you just kind of a simple way to look at it. I look for years of 3. So if the same weather patterns are pervading for 3 years in a row, that's not just random happenstance. That's the new trend on where the jet stream flows are setting up to lock in place later on around 2025 to 2028. Now you have to realize, since we're just entering the grand solar minimum right now, the greatest intensification and the greatest movements in our cloud bands and the jet streams and the atmosphere is occurring right now, and shall occur through the next 3 to 4 years. But after they get some more stabilization, it's almost like throwing a rock in a pond. As soon as it goes kaboom, those first biggest waves are kind of what we're getting now. But, you know, after a few more seconds, those waves start to, you know, flatten, and the ripple becomes more even and evenly spaced. It's something like this. So the greatest amount of change we're going to experience, at least in this first wave of 2 waves here, is going to be through these next 3 years. So if it's snowing and it's a 3rd year of record snow where you're living, I'm almost going to say, not 100%, nothing's 100% for sure, but at least above 90%, that the following year is also going to have record snow in your same area. If you're getting floods, if your area is getting wetter, I know you're down in Arizona, and we just saw those floods down in Death Valley. That's the 2nd year in a row. We got the record snows across Arizona and Nevada this year. That's the 2nd year in a row with the rains. Everywhere's record rain, record snow all across the desert Southwest. So this is absolutely a spot that's going to get wetter. So you should be looking for increased agricultural possibilities down in the desert Southwest of the U.S., whereas some places up in, say, Newfoundland, Canada, they're going to go completely offline in some of these areas first. It's the third year in a row where Christmas trees are dying because it's too cold. Vineyards are lost. They can't much up there in the Newfoundland area. And again, I wish you would double check and really take a look to see what the devastation is in the agriculture across some of these areas in Canada. And, we're looking at the record snows in Europe again through the scan third year in a row. Winds and snows across the Adriatic. So some of these areas are what I would consider hotspots, not in terms of temperature, but in terms of massive shifts in the climate. So the Alps of let's say from Austria down through Italy and over to Slovenia, that whole area, more record snow, especially France. These are the same areas that they were talked about in the 1600s that got hit tremendously versus other areas that were less, I should say, affected on the periphery. But Croatia, another place, absolutely going to be in Turkey. Look at North Africa, more record snow just last week. Snowed in Saudi Arabia 2 weeks ago. In the beginning of April, they said it never happened before. It should be 90 degrees there. We get more record snow in Morocco the last couple of days. So when you look at the Sahel as well, there's getting much more rainfall there. And after I don't want to ramble on too long. I'd like to let you talk, but please come back to record rainfalls, because what I'm seeing indicated here with the amount of rainfalls across desert areas that haven't seen rain in 3,600 years, starting to flood across these same rivers where settlements were abandoned 2,000, 3,000 years ago due to the drying effect, where something shifted in the climate. So, personal opinion, are at a 400-year cycle? Sure, we absolutely are. But how many of those 400-year cycles are culminating in even to the next step higher? 2,000-year cycle, 3,600-year cycle, 9 cycles of 4? Not sure, but something has definitely shifted to the point where deserts are now greening again.
Yeah, the Arizona desert, it's definitely not, doesn't seem like it's quite getting as hot as it should yet. And it's a funny thing where I look at the rest of the nation, everybody's freezing, and here in Arizona, we're like, wow, this is kind of nice. It's not quite so hot. So, yeah, the idea of Arizona becoming green again, well, if you live here, that's wonderful. But of course, that's not going to be so easy. That transition to going from green to desert is going to be much more difficult in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, for sure. And something we talked about earlier was cryptocurrency in Venezuela. And it's really something to see there, because one thing I think is, you mentioned economy. And so as the economy changes going into a grand solar minimum, how do you feel that's going to look in regards to cryptocurrency? Because it seems that fiat currencies are going to have issues, especially if governments can't really stay stable.
Yeah, you allude to the point. Why did the Roman Empire collapse? They should have kept going. How about the Akkadian Empire? You ever hear of them? Why have all these empires back through time just suddenly collapsed, even back to the Sumerians? When you look back in the record, look for them falling on a 400-year cycle. It'll be something with an even. 1600, 2000, 1200, 800, 400. Keep going back in time. BC, you got 400, 800 BC, 1200 BC, and you start to see the routine. 1600 BC is when they put the Assyrians at the collapse. Gee, imagine that on a 400-year cycle again. So the first question I might even ask, let's talk about the real economy first. So take you back to 2008 and 9. Fuel prices get really high. So I'll pose the question to everybody listening here. If your food triples in price or quadruples in price, what are the first things that you'll stop spending on to redivert that money into your food? Like, really, take a look. You have, let's say you have extra XYZ amount at the end of each month that you're spending on other things. You're going to have to redivert that into food. So what's the first things that you're going to stop spending on? So those are the kind of companies that will have the most difficulty on the traditional stock market. And that ripple's going to go through, because you talk about just-in-time delivery. Everything's based on credit. So if the credit locks up, how are they going to be able to buy? How are they going to pay for shipping moving out? LCs, what do you think that is? Well, what do you think? Do you think shipping, you pay for cash and then they send a container over? It doesn't work that way. Cryptocurrency, smart contracts, is something that has value that's universally accepted as value. Like, why does gold and silver still have universal value?
because globally it's accepted as valuable. Whatever paper money sits next to the gold, it always has some paper value associated with it, or food value. Because remember, the dinar back, let's go back to, denarius, one of the things. Pieces of silver were not what you could buy the food for back in the day. The silver was related to the grains of food representing silver. See, we got it opposite. You use the silver to buy the food. Before it was the amount of grain, because food was so valuable that represented the amount of silver. Completely the opposite. So when you start to think like this, like, wow, they counted it down to the single grain of barley to get that piece of silver trade. That's incredible. That's one too many, pull it back. A grain of barley. That's how intense the measurements were at that time. So if I'm going to still trade with you globally, and the U.S. is falling, the yen's falling, the yuan down in China's falling, or Venezuela, whatever currencies we're using, if they're no longer accepted, what are we going to use for trade? And I really think smart contracts using cryptocurrency of our choice is going to be the solution. Now, I'd like your thoughts too, because we did talk about crypto there shortly, and I'm sure a lot of people are going, "What did he just say?" So, moving forward, you can see moving over to Hashgraph for sure at the end of this whole thing, this interim step of the blockchain moving over to Hashgraph for everything. Great, this will run us through the next 12 to 15 years, but you're definitely going to need to know what this blockchain thing is and the cryptocurrency. Forget Hashgraph, you'll learn about that later on, but this is just the middle step to get us to that last ultimate step.
Well, you definitely can see the importance of cryptocurrency, how it works in Venezuela, for instance. In Venezuela, looking at local Bitcoins, people buying Bitcoins there, and also Bitcoin volume as far as transactions, it's just off the charts. I think last week was an all-time high there in Venezuela. And if you look at the graph compared to before their economy collapsed and now, it's amazing. And then also another cryptocurrency, Dash, I think it's one of the top 100. Dash is up there. And the reason Dash has been used so much there is because you don't need internet access to do Dash transactions. You can do it via text. You can text them back and forth. And so something that I know I look into that I've been studying is the ability to make cryptocurrency transactions without internet, person to person. Dash helps, being able to text helps, but I do see something that I think is important to do is you can always print a paper wallet, and you can be Bitcoin, and you can just say, okay, I'm going to have a bunch of printed pieces of paper basically that enable me to give somebody $20 or $100 or $5, and you just have stacks of those because how do you do cryptocurrency transactions if you don't have an internet? If that's intermittent and not working. So a lot of these things are already happening in Venezuela. So I hope people are looking there if they have an interest in cryptocurrency and look at what's happening in Venezuela, because it's inevitably coming and a lot has been figured out there.
And please remember to join us for part 2 of our discussion. And if you're looking for more information on the Grand Solar Minimum 30 minutes at a time, mini Ice Age Conversations podcast, anywhere podcasts are hosted across the net. And I've also begun to upload on Minds.com. If you're over on Minds, subscribe to Adapt 2030 and I'll keep a feed coming through with new information daily.